You've heard of EITC, right? It's money on the table, and now more than ever, families need that cash. But what is EITC? Elephants in taco costumes? I don't think so. Eagles ignoring tremendous clams? I don't even know what that is. EITC is the Earned Income Tax Credit. Since 1975, the bipartisan program has helped low-income workers, putting cash back into their pockets. Those bucks are often spent at local businesses, and that helps the entire community. And because families on EITC worry just a little bit less about money, kids do better in school. And believe it or not, less stress means people stay healthier. So now you know what EITC is, and what it isn't. Today, federal EITC is available to all, and additional help on the local level is available in 28 states and the District of Columbia. But the program can do more. Click here to find out what services are available in your area.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for our 10th RF Breakthrough. My name is Danielle Goonan, and I am Managing Director of Economic Policy, Investments, and Grant Making on the Rockefeller Foundation's Equity and Economic Opportunity team. Our team believes that every person in the United States who works should be able to meet the basic needs of their family and have a path to a better future. And we act on that belief by making investments that advance the economic stability of workers in the U.S., particularly those who are undervalued and underpaid, a group that is disproportionately people of color and women. To that end, we believe that the tax code can be used as a tool to improve workers' stability while working to close racial and gender equity gaps. So, why are we here today, less than 1 month before? According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, in 2018, 11% of earnings for workers in the lowest quintile went to state and local taxes, compared to 7% of earnings for workers in the top 1%. Tax programs such as the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, temporarily expanded earlier this month in the American Recovery Plan, helped to reward work, but the tax code as a whole does not always reflect this value. However, we can design the system in a way that values workers and promotes economic stability at the federal, state, and local levels. Today's panelists are working to rewrite the tax code to do just that. Fatima Goss is president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center, where she served for more than a decade, fighting to advance opportunities for women and girls. Also, she's a co-founder of the Time's Up Legal Defense. Dr. Darrick Hamilton is one of the leading economists examining race, stratification, and disparity, and is a Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and a university professor at the New School. He is also the director of the New School's Institute on Race and Political Economy. Samuel Hammond is the director of Poverty and Welfare Policy at the Niskanen Center. His research focuses on the effectiveness of cash transfers in alleviating poverty and how free markets can be complemented by robust systems of social insurance. His commentary has been published in The Atlantic, The National Review, and The American Conservative. And Pierre Joseph is the principal at P.E. Joseph Consulting. He supports foundations, philanthropic serving organizations, and nonprofits to deepen their strategy and accelerate impact. His work intersects with how emerging financing strategies, blending funding streams, and democratized access to capital can build wealth, expand opportunity, and increase economic mobility in underserved communities throughout the United States. Thank you all for joining us today. Fatima, I would like to start with you, because in late 2019, the National Women's Law Center released 3 interrelated reports examining the Fed with a focus on gender and racial equity. What do your findings tell us about whether or not our tax system actually values work?
Well, I'm really glad to be here, and we dug in with our reports for several reasons. The first is because that we believed that the U.S. tax system doesn't value all of the work of all workers, and that there were incentives offered through the tax system that allow some workers to build wealth and other workers to really struggle, and that it doesn't work for everyday workers, a thing that we saw escalate in this pandemic, as essential workers, who were the ones we were all relying on and giving the title of essential, certainly aren't treated that way by the tax code. And so one of the reasons we decided to do that was to expose that, and also expose the racist and sexist underpinnings of it. And I just related to that, have to say that, with the American Rescue Plan that just passed, and with the expanded child tax credit, we immediately understood that we would face arguments about that tax credit disincentivizing people from working. And the reason that you face those sorts of arguments right away is because of the long-standing story and tropes we tell ourselves about the workers who are paid the least. And so that investment that we have in the American Rescue Plan really highlights the opportunity to rewrite that story, rewrite who should be valued in our tax code and valued generally in our workforce.
Thank you. Dr. Hamilton, I want to piggyback on this by going to you. You argue that taxation should be used as a fiscal tool. If we as a country used it that way, what changes would we make to the tax system, and how would those changes benefit workers to rewrite that story that Fatima mentioned?
Thank you. And Danielle, you should always feel free to call me Darrick as well in this panel and anywhere. Beyond revenue collection, we need to recognize that the tax code is indeed our greatest fiscal tool. It should reflect our values. Government has a fiduciary responsibility to promote economic inclusion, civic engagement, and social equity. And frankly, what better mechanism than through taxes, which, as I mentioned, is our biggest fiscal tool. We should also use taxes to rein in plutocracy. If we have large concentrations of wealth at the top, which is why I'm glad that Congress is taking up a wealth tax as a mechanism to rein in plutocracy, it's anti-democratic for very few people to control so much of our economic resources. So again, beyond revenue collection, the fact that we have that concentration is reason enough that we should have a wealth tax. And if we look at our current values, the ways in which we differentially tax capital gains versus wages is reflective of our values. It's reflective of are we taxing a wealthy class differently than we're taxing workers? It doesn't have to be that way. And it's okay if we want to promote asset accumulation because assets are different than income. But the problem is to whom that asset allocation is allocated. We should recognize that the tax code can also provide direct income supports or direct asset building mechanisms to Americans. We have seen this with the precedent during this pandemic of the First CARES Act. And right now, the new bill put out by President Biden for the American Recovery Act is showing how the IRS and Treasury can put resources directly in the hands of people. Refundable tax credits, that's a no-brainer. You led off with a video about EITC, a way of putting, it's basically a negative income tax. Why don't we even go further and relax the work requirement? Why is it that we require people to have to work to get their earned income tax credit? We can put money directly into people's hands. We've done it, there's precedent. And I think now is the time for tax reform to be economically inclusive, civically engaged so that it's promoting democracy, and everyone should take part in the tax code. And then finally, socially equitable.
Thank you. Sam, I want to go on to you because you often talk about how the IRS's administration and implementation of the tax code factors into this. Can you help broaden the conversation by talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So for better or worse, the U.S. Has fiscalized a lot of its social policy, by which I mean we do things that are normally done in social agencies like the Social Security Administration through the tax code. And that has led to these inequities that we're speaking about. So, when the child tax credit was first implemented, it was billed as a form of tax relief for working families. And now we're moving into an era where families will be receiving it unconditionally. And that is a very positive change, but it's also a reflection of a shift in understanding of how we think about these programs. They're not merely a form of tax relief, but rather a benefit that we're using the tax code to administer. And that runs into some natural problems, but it's a thing that we're kind of path dependent on. We've walked down this path, and now the goal is to make the IRS work better and make it an agency that can actually respond and be nimble enough to reach those households that do not file taxes regularly, and to be able to make the adjustments mid-year for when you have families that are changing their household status.
Thank you. Pierre, I want to go on to you and talk a little bit about workers. You and I have spoken about this at length, and as you know, I'm still scratching my head trying to understand why taxation is viewed as a worker issue. There seems to be a divide between tax revenue and budget issues and worker power issues. Can you help us understand why the tax code isn't at the heart of the worker movement and what we would need to do to have Americans marching in the streets?
Yeah, thank you, Danielle, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. I think for me, the erosion of worker power and the upside down tax code are really two strategies designed to diminish political and economic power that's necessary for a more representative democracy. And I think about this in a couple of ways. One, when you look at the American story, it's really predicated on a few things: extraction of wealth, exclusion of people of color at the beginning and the founding of our country, and through subsequent, largely political organizing activities, you've seen the extension of citizenship and voting rights to folks who haven't had it before. And we're kind of like at this point in time where, under this scheme, the extension of this representative democracy is really underpinned by political organizing. And I think a key element of the story is around worker power and the ability of regular folks through collective action to rewrite the rules. And what's happened over the past 40 years with the Taft-Hartley Act, the assault on unions in the 70s, the battles really over the last 4 years over unions, what's really happened is workers have lost the ability through their workplaces to have a pathway to power and economic democracy. So there's this broader question around, with this loss of economic power in the workplace and the suppression of wages over time, how is it that regular working class people and folks of color can actually expand both their political power and economic power in this moment? And I think it's also important to understand that taxes and political power are intertwined. If you look at the history of taxes in this country, largely in the South after Reconstruction, in 1890, Mississippi was the first state in the Union that passed a supermajority in order for any tax legislation to pass. That has been on the books for the past 140 years. Alabama was one of the first places that passed limits on property taxes in favor of a sales tax. And Mississippi was also the state that passed the first sales tax in the country. And in some of the debates around the passage of that legislation, it was designed in order to fund the various services of government on the backs of poor folks. And what this underscores is a tax code at the local, at the state, and the federal level that is largely unresponsive to the needs of working folks.
So I want to build on that by talking about recurring cash payments, whether or not there's a role of recurring cash payments in expanding the political and economic power for workers. A poll was commissioned by the Economic Security Project Commission, TaxMart, and Mayors for Guaranteed Income that found that 58% of voters in 7 key states support recurring stimulus checks. Darrick, what's the role of the tax code and tax payments in promoting equity, reducing the racial wealth gap, and increasing worker power?
Again, thank you for that important question. Let's think about wealth inequality. The main component of wealth inequality is generally assets. And right now, our existing tax code privileges existing wealth rather than seeding new wealth. We spend in excess of $650 billion through tax subsidies or tax deductions, in the ways in which we tax capital gains different than we tax income, mortgage interest deductions, and various other tax policies. So that $650 billion number, it in and of itself is not the problem. The problem is to whom it's distributed. It's distributed in such a way that the top 1% receive about a third of that allocation, and the bottom 60% of earners receive about 5% of that allocation. So if we want to promote asset inclusion, then we would come up with other policies that promote, that seed people with some resources so that they can get into an asset like a home, like a debt-free education, like some capital to start a business, to create new wealth, to create new avenues for people who don't have access to economic security of an asset to actually have one. Baby bonds is one such program, but there can be others. The key point is making sure that people have access to capital. So the tax code could be restructured in a way to promote more asset security than what we're currently doing. The second component of the ways in which our tax code contributes to economic vulnerability and wealth inequality is the debt side. Right now, many Americans, their wages, their income is volatile. They might not know how much income they're going to make from week to week because we've shifted a lot of risk and security onto workers. We've fissured our workforce in such a way that sometimes people will go through periods where they don't have enough income to make their basic needs. And what does that lead to? It leads to indentured borrowing, not borrowing as a choice, but borrowing as a mechanism for subsistence, borrowing in a way where workers have limited power by which to engage the finance system. So they end up borrowing at terms that are subprime, that are not, take payday loans. Payday loans, as an example, is not the result of people with financial illiteracy. People turn to payday loans after they've exhausted every other avenue, every other opportunity, can't borrow from friends and family, and then as a result end up in these debt traps where they take out loans with exuberant interest rates and they're not paying down principals, but they're trying to cover the interest till eventually they end up defaulting anyway. So we can come up with a tax code that provides greater income security that leaves people less vulnerable to have to take out predatory debt.
Fatima, I know that you talk about the considerations that need to guide the debate around cash payments, the narrative you have to change. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, as Darrick was talking, I was just thinking about what has happened in this last year. Women are the majority of low-wage workers. Disproportionately, women of color are in those types of jobs. And in some parts of the economy, we saw total shutdowns of sectors or hours reduced to so minimal hours. And so what we're really up against is a refusal to see reality for workers who are in the lowest paid jobs, and a public narrative that is rooted in these old racist, sexist tropes about women of color not wanting to work, about disincentivizing work. And so there's this idea that regular cash payments would disincentivize work, when we actually know the opposite is true, that people, if you have a little bit of financial cushion, then your life is in less of an emergency if your car breaks down or if one thing goes wrong, making you unable to get to and keep your job. The other thing is, in this last year, when mostly women have been forged in the worst care crisis in more than a generation, and working and homeschooling and caring all at the same time, if a cash payment meant that you didn't have to have an extra job on top of an extra job, or that you didn't actually have to pretend that it was possible to be an essential worker and watch your 6-year-old at the same time, that would not be a bad thing. That should be a thing that we should value. So part of what we have to do is flip upside down on its head the idea around whose lives are valued, which families are valued, which work is valued, and those notions that have really we've been carrying around for many, many decades have to be just disrupted.
So sticking with you, Fatima, do you think that now is the time to reimagine the tax code? And if so, why is that?
Well, one of the reasons that we have to reimagine the tax code in a serious way is that we are going to need more revenues to actually meet the demands of today. We're going to need more revenues to do more than relief, but to actually have our recovery happen, as the Biden administration would say, to actually build back better. And this pandemic has been a pandemic of two tales of types of people, where you have seen wealth generation accelerate for a very small percentage of people, while others have really struggled. And so that is the perfect time to re-examine what is driving that difference, and whether or not we're going to be able to meet the needs of the future. We actually need to be able to resource things like childcare at scale to meet the needs of families, things like healthcare at scale, things like paid family and medical leave, so that you don't have to kind of luck into the right boss in order to be able to care for yourself or care for a loved one when a health emergency meets you, or at the time you're having a new child. And so if we think about the growth in billionaires' incomes in this pandemic, and really how unpopular that the Trump tax cuts were. We were saddled going into this pandemic with tax cuts that made absolute no sense and were wrong for our system and were inequitable at its core. And so it's our real hope that people will see that and adjust. The Institute for Women's Policy Research is out with a new poll that shows that taxes are a priority for women. There is this idea that people don't care about it, but actually people are thinking about it. They're thinking about this unequal time and whether or not we will have both the political will, but also the revenue to do the big important things we need to be able to do as a country.
I want to build on that idea that women care about taxes. I've been in this space for almost 2 years now, and an argument I hear over and over again is taxes are wonky, which is why Americans don't engage. They're too complicated. At best, is that a lazy excuse? At worst, is it an elitist excuse? Pierre, I want to go to you. What do we actually know about what Americans think about taxes, and why haven't we done a better job engaging them on these issues?
Yeah, I think the reason why we haven't done a good job engaging Americans on these issues is that I think this largely from the philanthropic perspective, like philanthropy doesn't think about this. In a lot of ways, we kind of say this is the province of the government. Philanthropy is concerned with meeting immediate need. But in reality, particularly in this moment, as we're really trying to reimagine how do we create a more regenerative economy, there is a role for philanthropy. I think folks get the EITC, folks get the CITC. There is a role to ensure that VITA programs are funded, to ensure that folks who have trouble filing their taxes are getting that free tax assistance. We're also seeing the expansion of efforts around unconditional cash, because again, we're at this moment in time where people need more resources. And to Fatima's point around revenue, we need to do a better job threading a narrative around what does it take from government, from philanthropy, and from the public to actually build an economy that works. And that starts with this conversation about revenue.
Can I push you a little further? You and me, we're in philanthropy. What do you want to see us doing? What do we need to be doing more? And what do we need to be asking our peers to be doing?
Right on. So I think if you are a funder and you largely fund policy, that is great. But at the same time, policy that sits on a shelf is not doing anybody any good. Those policies and the grants that go behind it in order to fund the research need to be deeply connected to civic engagement and movement building. So if you are one of those funders out there, that is a clear policy funder, connect with the organizations within your community. Make sure that you're in right relationship, understanding what the needs are at the local level, and what does it take to actually build more inclusive economies. I think the worst thing that can happen, again, is the policies sit on a shelf, but what is the best thing that can happen? You can bring together think tanks and organizations that do research with movement organizations that are grounded in community, that are trying to build base. And through conversations, through broader civic engagement, we can reach more equitable policies as folks go to advocate at their at the city level, at the local state legislature, or in this case right now, since the headwinds have turned at the federal level, in order to have broader change. And I think to funders on the left, some of the civic engagement funders, we can't keep funding civic engagement and power building in a vacuum. We build power in order to enact and create the world that we want to see. And in order to really, I think, see investments in civic engagement actually help improve material condition, general operating support funding needs to be made available to civic engagement groups to do more than just sit and have visioning conversations, because now is a moment for action.
Thank you. Sam, Pierre talked about philanthropy, but he mentioned government. So I want to turn to you and talk a little bit about the Biden administration, the stimulus package that passed earlier this month, but also tax legislation that might be coming down the pike in the future. What aspects of the COVID stimulus plan that passed earlier this month would you want to make permanent? And are there things coming down the pike in terms of a larger tax bill that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so it's already been alluded to. The Biden rescue plan includes a fully refundable child tax credit, but importantly, it's only for 1 year, and that is due to the procedural constraints of the budget reconciliation process by which they passed it. But what it means is that by December, we'll be back into a debate about how to reform that credit or make it permanent. And the message I've been sending is the U.S. is alone among developed countries in not having a fully refundable child benefit, one that reaches families regardless of their income. And we should not want to have a fiscal cliff that isn't any ordinary fiscal cliff, but a fiscal cliff that potentially throws 10 million children back into poverty. So it's really important that this be made permanent, and part of that requires raising revenue. And just to go back to some of the earlier comments, the tax code, much like our legal code, serves as a kind of operating system for the economy as a whole. So to not think about the tax code and how to make it better, it leaves a huge swath of social policy off the table. And what's really important is, going back to this question of complexity, in the program like the Earned Income Tax Credit, fully 39% of IRS audits in 2019 were for EITC tax returns. That is a huge misallocation of IRS resources. These are people who had $15,000 in income, but they accidentally said they have $15,500 in income and now are being hounded by the IRS. Part of that stems from sheer complexity. So within our tax code, for instance, and across our benefit system, there are over 30 different definitions of qualifying child. And so does your child qualify for program XYZ? You have to be basically a tax expert to understand this. And this complexity tax is a problem both for administering benefits like a child allowance in the longer run, but in the shorter run, it is a tax that's inherently regressive, because if you're high income and you're storing billions of dollars of wealth in the Cayman Islands or what have you, the IRS is not prioritizing you. But moreover, the complexity that you're able to exploit doesn't feel like a cost because you're able to hire the best tax accountants. So often on the right, you hear lots of talk about tax simplification, but really little has been done in generations to genuinely simplify the tax code, to make it easier to understand, and to make it so you don't have to be a tax expert to actually get the benefits you're entitled to.
So we're going to turn to some questions from the audience now. We're going to go to Stephen Jones. And Darrick, this one's for you. What are the positives and negatives of taxing enough to balance the budget? Since you care about fiscal policy, I thought I should throw that one your way.
So let me lead with the American government is a sovereign monetary entity that has immense power to pay for things. Let me lead with that. Pay-go has become a problem. If we think about the politics of pay-go, only one side of the aisle actually pays attention to it. When Republicans are thinking about tax cuts, pay-go is never part of the conversation. But fortunately, at least now during the pandemic, it seems as though we're willing to suspend pay-go. But Frank, we should not be so constrained in general with pay-go, even beyond the pandemic, especially when it comes to investing in America's most treasured resource, and that's its people. So this is empirical realities with regards to our capacities to fund things, but also narratives. We use the word like deficit or thinking about the federal government as a household budget, as a household that has to balance their budget. Those are mythologies. The federal government is not like a household because you don't have your ability to print your money and have an army to come in and impose upon other people that they have to use your money in order to pay taxes. So, I'm not making an argument that we can spend ad infinitum, that inflation isn't an issue, that eventually we could get to a scenario where the cost to borrow exceeds the return on our ability to grow the economy. These are macro issues that we have to be cognizant of. But pay-go as a constraint by which we lead is a big problem. It's a political problem as well as a fiscal problem. And then finally, just to put a button on this question, I'm for taxing the rich, largely because, like I said before, it's anti-democratic for the top 0.1% of earners in America to own 90% of the nation's wealth. We would be naive to not think that immense amount of economic power doesn't impact our ability to have participatory democracy as it relates to policy writ large.
Thank you. Fatima, I know you also have some commentary on the pay-go, so I wanted to turn to you and see if you wanted to add anything to what Darrick said.
Well, my favorite thing that Darrick said was that the budget is not like a household. And the story that we tell ourselves about that is precisely how we end up in a situation. But I will add that we were just in a situation around the Trump tax cuts where there were, quickly racing to cut taxes for the wealthiest without regard to how you're going to pay for it going forward. And I was really not at all surprised that within weeks you heard the same people who voted for those tax cuts on TV shows talking about how broke we were as a country and how we needed to cut essential programs for our lowest income families. And so part of even having the conversation within this narrow box means that you are accepting the notion that we have not only limited resources, but limited resources that must go to the top. So I totally agree with Dr. Hamilton.
Not surprised on that one. Before we turn to the next question, I just want to give a shout out to the digital audience that is tuned in from all over the United States and quite frankly, also abroad. We actually have a question here from Sierra Leone, which I'm excited to get to. I just want to ask them to please continue to send in their questions for our panel. And I'll be continuing to work off the questions we received pre-start of the event. The next question I wanted to throw at Sam. Sam, we talked a lot about equity on this call. We do have a question from Brianna McKinney from the United States that asks, are there any proposals that strike between the political advantages of universality and the need for targeted investments that close the racial and gender wealth gaps, or must we choose?
Yeah, I don't think you have to choose. In fact, take this expanded child tax credit. A child allowance, by far, even though it's universal or quasi-universal, it's based on the number of kids you have. By far helps to close income and wealth gaps between Black and Hispanic households, who are by far the households who have been excluded from the status quo ante. So you can get to you can help close wealth gaps by being universal, by being genuinely universal. Unfortunately, what we've done in the past is have programs that are explicitly targeted to a middle class population that carves out the top and the bottom for exclusion. And it's time that we unwind that exclusion. And I want to keep coming back to this complexity point. Solving complexity issues is something that benefits households regardless of their background. But when Black and brown households are disproportionately the ones that are claiming programs like the EITC and then risking being audited, not because they did anything wrong, but because of the 40 pages of rules that they have to navigate, that is a problem. It's a problem in terms of how we're prioritizing resources, and a problem of how we're setting up these programs in the first place to lead people into making unintentional errors that they're then punished for.
Thank you. Pierre, we have a question from Alicia DeFazio. And since you do have done place-based and regional-based work, I wanted to throw this one at you. She said, with an eye toward racial equity, what findings have you come across regarding the effectiveness of UBI and wealth tax proposals? Are there specific city-based successes that you can point to?
Yeah, so on the UBI question, obviously we've seen a lot of the work with the Stockton example with Mayor Tubbs, which has largely been successful in providing folks a $500 monthly cash payment that allowed folks to have more time to do the things that they cared about and also have money to pay extra bills. We've also seen, also funded by the Economic Security Project, the Magnolia Mothers Trust, another example where Springboard to Opportunities designed another $1,000 cash payment going to, I think it was 23 mothers in Jackson, Mississippi. This project was not funded by philanthropy. Instead, it was funded by some private donors, because philanthropy kind of views some of these projects as outside of what they would traditionally fund. And you're also in Massachusetts, you're also seeing a range of smaller UBI projects. Boston College with the Midas Collaborative has been working on setting up a small, I believe, $200 payment program. In the nonprofit space, we've also seen organizations like Free From that launched a survivor safety fund in response to this pandemic, and through a GoFundMe was able to raise over $200,000 in order to provide $200 cash payments to survivors of intimate partner violence. And I think this is really underscoring that this is a moment of innovation and exploration, and it's important for, I think, both folks, policymakers in government and also philanthropy to really understand what is it that we can do in order to accelerate some of these demonstrations and initiatives so we can have more data around whether or not these can work over the long term, and then what is required in order to scale these largely in terms of revenue.
Thank you. Fatima, coming back to you, we have a question here from Glenda Winna from the United States. I'd like to learn more about how property taxes, excise taxes, and so-called indirect taxes is to achieve socioeconomic.
Well, one of the things that I think we have to be careful about is how it is that we think about expanding taxes in ways that are subtly and quietly also harming low-income and middle-income people in these times. And so one of the things that we know is that in some places, the property tax rates are so low, but the consumer tax rates are so high, they have a particular effect on low-income people. So I have to say, though, the biggest thing that I think would make one of the most significant differences is actually in looking at the tax code, going after the broader set of wealth. So your thoughts around both excise taxes and property taxes are one, but there's lots of transfers of wealth that are happening in. And if we go back to even where we were before the Trump tax cuts, that would be an initial boon in terms of revenues to do more for all of us in this time.
Darrick, I'm going to come to you. We have a question from Sierra Leone, Momo Ture. The question is, the effect of multinational companies bullying developing countries so they can avoid taxes. What can be done to ensure they pay fair taxes in those countries? I know you're doing some tax work globally, so I wanted to make sure you had a chance to respond to this.
So the work of Piketty demonstrates well beyond national borders the immorality of the ways in which capital gets privileged in an international landscape over people, over workers, and capital generally represents the elite. So I certainly appreciate the sentiments of the question, and from a moral standpoint, we need some international regulatory mechanisms to promote justice beyond particular nation-state borders. Indeed, if we were to extrapolate even further, I think the American industrial and trade policy needs to have a readjustment. Right now, it's very firm-centric. Right now, it centers on how can we benefit the firms in a way that will trickle down to all of us. And that word trickle is the key word, trickle. It doesn't have to be that way. We could think about putting workers, putting people first in our intentional industrial trade policy, as well as tax policy, in a way that promotes growth, that promotes economic security, and frankly will benefit firms as well. If you have, for example, workers who care less about childcare, workers who care less about an elder parent because they know that there's a structure out there where they're well taken care of, they will function better at work. So in other words, what I'm for is the state should absolutely be involved intentionally in promoting industrial, global trade and tax policy, but that in general, we need a reorientation to put workers first, with the idea that that's going to generate spillover effects to not only benefit workers directly, but our corporate interests, and do it in a way that is just from not just a nation, an internal nation perspective, but an international perspective.
Thank you. So I want to turn to the middle class. We have a question here about the middle class, and I know we're talking about workers, particularly low-wage workers, but there are, at least in my opinion, times where we pit different types of workers against each other, low-wage workers versus the middle class, et cetera. And this is for anyone on the panel, and folks, feel free to jump in, but how would deductions be reimagined for the middle class workers tasked with both raising a family, putting kids through college, and saving for retirement simultaneously? And that's from Lisa McGill.
All right, nobody else jumped, so I'll jump first and say, was somebody else speaking? I'm sorry. No, you go.
I was, but well, anyway, what I was just going to say is even that the list of things that you identified really demonstrate that our understanding around what family needs are in this time are really limited. Things like childcare are unaffordable for the lowest income families, but the truth of the matter is they're unaffordable for most families. And that has a particular effect not only on the families who are struggling to scrape together enough funds to actually afford childcare. Childcare is more than the cost of many state colleges in some states. But it also means and contributes to the reason that our whole system is based on paying workers who are largely women of color poverty wages. And we see that sort of idea replicate where people are squeezed at all ends without having some universal programs that ensure that people are captured around things like childcare, things like paid leave. We have to actually decide as a country whether these sorts of infrastructure things matter to us families, and they'll help not only the lowest income families, but they will help families across the spectrum.
You know, and like Pierre, I'm going to give a shout out. All right, I'll go now. So like Pierre, I'll give a shout out to the Economic Security Project and the fact that they sponsored a paper that we're working on that is aimed at reforming the earned income tax credit. So I'm also going to build on Fatima's response and say, these narratives of deserving and undeserving, why is it that the earned income tax credit has to require work? Why don't we directly eliminate poverty by lifting up the earned income tax credit to start at poverty, so that anybody can, whether they're working or not, receives at least direct support so that they're not below poverty. I would argue that that's a political choice. We can make that choice and actually literally eliminate poverty. And it's not a radical idea. Martin Luther King talked about it with Poor People's Campaign. There have been other iterations of people that have talked about government literally offering cash support to eliminate poverty. And to answer the question, with the EITC, there's no reason that it has to stop at just an anti-poverty program. We could, a better way than UBI from my perspective would be income supports all the way up to the middle class. So we could link the earned income tax credit not only to eliminate poverty, but to the median income, so that people are getting income supports all the way up to the medium as a way to promote not only poverty reduction or poverty elimination, but also lifting people up towards the middle class in a perpetual way on a permanent basis.
Yeah, I wanted to go directly to the question about deductions. So by nature, deductions benefit you more if you have a large federal income tax liability to deduct in the first place. And the U.S. in 2019 collected 24% of GDP in tax revenues across all sources. That includes payroll taxes, property taxes, personal and corporate income taxes. The OECD average is 34%. So we're collecting 10 percentage points less revenue than the typical developed country in the OECD. And one of the reasons we get away with that is because we have this large subterranean welfare state for the middle and upper middle classes delivered through deductions and deferrals and tax exclusions. And so, take employer-sponsored health insurance, for example. It's the single largest tax expenditure in the tax code. It derives from the fact that employers are able to provide health benefits in a way that are untaxed. That amounts to just under $300 billion a year in outlays. That's half the cost of Medicaid, right? So the federal government is implicitly subsidizing all our health insurance. I get great health insurance through my employer, but I don't feel like I'm connected to the government. I feel like I'm getting this because I earned it and my employer is providing it for me as a perk. But in fact, they're subsidized to the tune of $300 billion a year. And that's derived from deductions. I think in the longer run, we need to look at moving away from these programs being delivered through deductions and tax exclusions, because not only because they end up benefiting the rich, but also because they're in some ways hidden from view. And when they're hidden from public scrutiny, we can't critique them, but also we get a very bifurcated system where I'm critiquing somebody for, someone is resentful for someone taking Medicaid, but not knowing that they're receiving at least as large a subsidy through their employer and the tax code.
Pierre, can I come to you for that? I wrote down something that Sam said, which is, I earned it. And there is a continuing myth in this country over who has earned what they deserve and who hasn't earned what they deserve. And there is just so much that we don't know about how everything we do in this country is somehow subsidized by the federal government or by state or local governments. Can you talk a little bit about narrative, which is, as we've talked about, a topic that I never fully understand what narrative change means, how to do it effectively. Are there examples that you've seen that have started to chip away at some of these really destructive narratives that exist? Yeah,
so the way to really chip at a lot of these destructive narratives is to form new ones. And a lot of that, I think, again, from the philanthropic perspective, is working inside of communities with trusted messengers to really understand, like, what is the particular history or story of a people within a place. And I think around this question of like deservedness, I kind of reject it, because we are the United States of America. We can afford to do anything that it is that we need to do. But I think it's a question around whether or not the work that we're doing around the tax code, the work that happens around narrative, is actually working to build a better democracy. And I think that is the question that we continually have to grapple with in this country, whether or not the idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you'll be successful, because over the last 10, 15 years, like, that has been proven false through a great recession that evaporated Black and brown wealth, through this current pandemic and the subsequent K-shaped recovery recession, where folks are still struggling. And it's a question of whether or not we in the United States of America can muster the political will to do what needs to be done, to provide for the common good.
Thank you. Okay, so we have one more question from the audience before we turn to our last question. This comes from Wilson Henry, who's actually on my team at the Rockefeller Foundation. We talked a little bit about, or it was mentioned on this panel, the wealth tax. So what role could a wealth tax play in advancing equity in the tax code?
Well, I will just say, coming off of this pandemic, where we have seen the rise and expansion of billionaires, you know, the last year has made the case for the wealth tax. There is no reason we as a country should be in a situation where we're debating whether or not we can take the really important steps that we need to recover at large, that we need to build back better, at the same time watching a rise in billionaires during a pandemic. And so in my mind, the wealth tax is one approach to ensuring that we have a tax system that is more equitable and that values work more fairly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would summarize it in 3 things. This time I yield.
Oh, I mean, I'm a bit of a wealth tax skeptic. You know, I think that the U.S. already has one of the most progressive federal tax codes across the world. You know, there's a place for soaking the rich. But I also want to take a more comparative lens at, you know, where do we want to get to? And if we want to get to be a modern social democracy, we're not going to get there by taxing the billionaires. You know, the entire Forbes 400, if you expropriated their entire wealth, assuming that it could even maintain its value, that would pay for about 2.5 years of Social Security. So you're not going to get the revenue from the rich. There might be a political dimension or a sheer equality dimension that might justify something like this. But in the longer run, if you want to actually have the sustainable base of revenues to support a modern social democracy, you're going to have to raise taxes on the upper middle class. That means the top 25%, not the top 0.1%.
So, you know, I would even add to the wealth tax and put a speculation tax on the stock market to avoid speculation that can generate potential bubbles, and also as another mechanism of generating revenue. But similar to Sam, I'd say that I support a wealth tax, but not necessarily for the fact that it's going to generate all sorts of revenue. It will indeed generate some revenue, but I support it because of the values it expresses, because it promotes democracy, and because it promotes social equity. The values are such that right now, the extent to which we tax wage income versus capital income is way out of whack, and we can make it more equitable and still promote asset development. I'm in favor of promoting asset development. Finally, it promotes democracy for the reasons I mentioned, because of all that economic power that rests in the hands of the few. That is anti-democratic, similar to both what Pierre and Fatima was saying, that when you have that concentration of power, to think that that doesn't spill over and affect our democracy, that's naive.
Well, I love that we're ending on democracy, because I think that's why we're all here, to make sure that the United States remains a strong democracy, but that it actually can become an equitable one as well. So with that, I'm going to close by asking each panelist to share anything I didn't ask you feels an important message or call to action for this discussion. Fatima, I'm going to start with you.
Well, again, I want to thank you for convening this conversation. And my call to action for those who say they are for gender justice, gender equity, is to begin to dig into the world of taxes. In some ways, we sort of see now as a once in a generation opportunity to really harness the power of the tax code to advance gender and racial equity and to really further an economy that works for all of us. We see it as a time where we can have conversations around who is rewarded and what sort of work is not rewarded in the tax code. And my final call to action is to tell a new story about those who are working, right? We have a chance to disrupt the old ideas that have followed women of color around disincentivizing work, around who works and who doesn't work. We have a chance to replace it with a story about families and what they need to thrive in this country.
Thank you. Pierre, on to you. What's your call to action?
Yeah, so you've got around 89,000 charitable foundations in this country, representing $890 billion worth of assets. And for philanthropy, at a minimum, get engaged on taxes. Fund VITA, fund EITC, fund CTC expansions, working in partnership with groups on the ground and states. I think the other point that I would make is within philanthropy, we need to have a real conversation around perhaps increasing the IRS guidelines around the 5% payout. These are very interesting times, and I think if we are going to build a more equitable economy, it's going to require more from philanthropy, more from folks who have the riskiest type of capital to help support civil society in creating the innovations that we need in order to get to a better vision of society.
Thank you. Sam, on to you. What's your call to action?
Well, as we've touched on a couple times, the Biden recovery plan includes a child allowance. It's only for 1 year, but amid this, there's been a huge debate about what its effects are going to be. And so I think anticipating that this will be debated near the end of the year, and people will appreciate having data about what the impacts have been in the short run. There's a huge role for philanthropy, from the biggest players to local organizations, to go out and identify households that are becoming newly eligible for the child tax credit, and to get the permission to tell their story and to track the results. If we have, Pierre mentioned earlier about the UBI pilot programs. This is no pilot program. This is a real natural experiment. And to learn from this experiment, we're going to need to collect data, and the more data, the better. So taxes can be a bit intimidating for organizations that aren't used to public policy. But if you want to participate nonetheless, the best way to do that is by collecting data and building the case for making the child credit reform permanent.
Well, you and I will have to have a call then to talk about this idea and figure out how we could galvanize philanthropy around that. And Darrick, last but not least, on to you. What's your call to action?
Social movements need to recognize that America's most potent fiscal tool goes well beyond revenue collection. It can promote democracy. It can promote economic security. And a big shout out to Dorothy Brown on her new book. Sadly, I'm forgetting the title right now, but it makes the case that we can't look at contemporary phenomena in an ahistoric frame, that the tax code itself has promoted racial and gender cleavages. So in thinking about universal policies, I think we certainly need the prefix of an anti-racist, anti-sexist, universal lens, so that by design and implementation, whatever new tax policy we implement is intentionally inclusive of those groups that have been historically left out and marginalized.
And with that, I want to thank all of you for your time today. I can't believe an hour has gone by. I wish we had another hour. And I just can't thank you enough for all of the ideas that you've provided. A lot for us at the Rockefeller Foundation to think about in terms of our own strategy. I'm looking forward to seeing how the field and the rest of Wellcome to react to this conversation as well. Thanks so much. Be well.